Honestly, never had to walk this far to get to the antique mall before. I've never seen this place so jamming. It's the fusion of the city moving east and coming up against the farm belt. But that brings us to a couple of other interesting things we'll get to see along the way. One is the BC Farm Museum. This is farm country, although it's changing rapidly, but the Fraser River Valley is very fertile and is really the only place in the lower mainland other than the Okanagan that has a lot of farmland in a valley. Really cool old farm implements, a lot of which have come from the area, and a lot of which were made in Canada. Fordson was a popular tractor. Henry Ford got the idea for building tractors once he saw how well the car building went with the assembly lines. The Cambridge, England radio is newer. The ice cream maker, on the other hand, looks very similar to the ones we use now, except now they're plastic or fiberglass. Great old cash register here. Scale bottles people have made. And then you get into the real stuff. The traction engine model here would actually run and work and has all of the parts like a real one would. I'm pretty amazed that people do these full-scale live steam models. These are worth, potentially many thousands, if not in the 5-figure range. Isn't this cute? A robe made from a handmade quilt. When you find quilts that are starting to go threadbare, this is a great use for them. Then we'll come on in here. We see the good old Kenmore console sewing machines. Consoles are hard to sell. Treadles sell more readily because they're a fun, interesting piece of furniture. There's an old white in the oak case from about 1900, but look at these interesting things. This one is a knitting machine, and apparently there are a whole bunch of different ones. There were lots of varieties of things during the early industrial age because everybody had a slightly better way to build a mousetrap, as they said. You might have to know how to use a loom to weave your own rugs if you lived out on the prairies in Canada or somewhere out in the Midwestern United States. I got to card wool at a similar exhibit in Delaware, and they made me the wool carder because it's the simplest thing to do. Various spinning wheels for flax and rope and other such things. And then the Singer Featherweight. These are worth about $300 to $500 depending on model and color. I like these puzzle boxes. They're by Singer too. They open up with all your implements in them and they fold into a little box. Not like this nice marquetry box somebody made here. Singer was a British company and Vickers was a competitor of theirs. Corn binder. I think I've had that at Cracker Barrel. This is interesting. One of the last milk delivery wagons used on Vancouver streets. That's pretty cool. It's been repainted, but that's neat that it lasted so long. And here's a picture of another one back in the day. Cream separators that could separate your dairy into various products were a huge advance for farms. And if you had the money and were doing the volume, especially on a dairy farm, you got one like this. De Laval is one of the most advertised ones that we see the old advertising for today, but this one is McCormick Deering, who made a lot of farm equipment. Peony has a name. Potato planter. A lot of these have been restored. A sail reaper to cut right standing grain. Isn't that interesting? It would blast through it with these big wooden blades and combs. This museum has been here almost as long as I've been alive, which is pretty impressive. Museums rely a lot on donations and people to be interested in such things and want to see them enough to keep them going. So it's great to see they've got a crowd today. And little kids learning too. This restored case piece is a cast iron store advertisement. It would have gone on top of the pillar of a building in all likelihood. It's pretty amazing. Old Abe is the eagle, by the way. Steam toys were popular in the early 1900s because steam engines were still widely used. This Sawyer Massey would have been used to power anything out on a farm. And in this case, it is a steam-powered tractor. Steam was considered a very viable form of powering things, including the railroads, into the 1940s. British Columbia has always been part of the Northwest lumber country. And so a log lathe is something you might expect to see out on a farm, especially when you were clearing in order to build a house and then have land for farming. Wow, a bunch of buggies of various styles and types. There's a farm wagon. I see a Surrey or two. Neat Ford 1-ton. I had a high school teacher who had a Plymouth that looked very similar to this back when they made trucks. This one's a 1947. And yes, it smells a little bit of grease and old oil, even though these things have been cleaned up quite a bit. These things ran for years and years and years, so you're just not going to get away from that. Look at that giant chainsaw, a couple of them up there, a two-man. That was to replace the old crosscut saws that people buy and hang in their houses, which were much more dangerous than the chainsaw because they bound more easily. Windmills worked really well for powering all sorts of things, especially in remote places, and I'm not sure why we got rid of them. They certainly seem to serve a good purpose. The old oxen yokes are great. Those are worth about $300 to $500 a piece now. I like the farm plows. Most of these end up as decoration outside in a garden these days. A hay press. This is interesting. There's a lot of little islands in the Fraser River. Some of them are covered with hundreds of thousands of people living in condos, and some of them were remote and small enough that they were just used for agriculture. So apparently this was used on Sea Island, which is out near the opening to the Georgia Strait, and it was horse-drawn. Amazing. Horses had to do a lot of work back then. They got a good deal when the car came along. Chatham Mill, Ontario. We see a lot of these sorts of various threshing machines and corn shuckers and other separators and processors. This one's a fanning mill, it says. We see a lot of these at the Springfield Antique Show in Ohio because they're still being found in the Midwest of the United States. A corn sheller, I've had an older version of this for sale. I think it sold for about $200. It was an interesting looking thing. Massey Harris pony. That was a lightweight tractor that was easy to drive and inexpensive after the Second World War, so people could get back to domestic farming instead of war production. Massey Harris, a big name here in Canada. This buckboard is a John Deere. And it says it's 100 years old, but it's probably a little older now. I think this was built around 1910. I haven't seen this contraption on the front of a tractor before. It's as if you would steer it, you crank the engine to get it to turn over, and then it's almost as if you could attach something to steer it from another direction. The Blacksmith Shop, and they're showing how they do it. It's quite an art. And the blacksmith generally made good money and was a very important person in town. I know museums are not a place that we can shop generally, although they do accession things, so don't always count that out. If you see a museum that has a lot of duplicates of things, some things might be for sale because they need to raise funds too. But I always enjoy seeing them anyway because you learn a lot more about the practical matters of life and how people really lived, and that explains a lot of the other things that we see in antiques and vintage and why they were considered so special when they were new. I remember when I was in the Studebaker Club that people would complain that Canadians tended to like bright colors and over-restore things. I have to say, this is contrary to that because this one has been left alone in the original paint. I think the green might have been trimmed out a little bit. But you can see how this was such an important machine that it got decoration you wouldn't expect sitting out on the farm. And really bright colors because you were going to spend a lot of money on this. And this is just after the Civil War. This one says it was built in 1880, so you have to have the heraldic eagle and the Union shield showing who's in control. Okay, this just makes me smile. I hope people notice this display once in a while. These guys use this rope to win those trophies in Tug of War team championships. I shouldn't publish this. This will become the new pickleball. Interestingly enough, they have a bunch of straight razors as well. Museums are fun because whatever anyone could donate that seemed sort of relevant or just fun, they'll generally take if they have the room. Then when they run out of room, that's when resellers can go to them and actually buy their excess. Marble automatic grain pickler, made in Wolseley, Saskatchewan. Donated by Country Lane Antiques, that's that shop we saw on the way into town. And because gun laws are tighter in Canada, you don't usually expect to see guns, but this is a museum, and so they're showing all of the things, primarily rifles, and a British Bulldog revolver, and a Jesse James Colt 45 in the upper right, that are things people needed to live on the prairies and fight in the First World War. You're out on a farm and you're living a tough life and working really hard. You want some fancy stuff to show you're doing well. You want a fancy wood stove with lots of nickel plating. You want a nice circulator. I guess that'd be like the humidifier fan of its time. I like the 60s cinder block, I have to admit. Of course, that's the thing I notice. The Philco Predicta television, so cool. The first swivel screen television. So far ahead of its time. These are worth several $100s, even if you don't use them. A surprising number of companies you wouldn't expect made refrigerators. Kelvinator was part of Nash Motors, and International Harvester made refrigerators too, a nice little apartment size from the 1930s. I was involved with an antique mall space once where my friend used this refrigerator or something similar to it as a display for 1930s and 40s kitchen stuff. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth. Now that seems like a long time ago. The first gold rush in BC was up the Fraser River in the 1850s, but the Klondike gold rush in the Yukon was the one that really helped put all of this on the map. And this is a nice collection of scales from that time. And a very cute family with a couple of little boys were quite bewildered by this. It does happen in nature on occasion. If you did get to do some sporting, well, it was probably something like this. Something out on the water, something on the snow, sledding, skiing. I like the old wooden skis, ice skating. This is what you did for fun. Lacrosse. Snowshoeing is something I'd like to try. Very cute Art Deco chair. You would have probably had an old pump organ, unless you could afford a piano. And then in the 1930s, even though it was the Depression, if you had some money, you bought yourself a console radio. And instruments and old music boxes, anything that was entertainment, because you didn't really get to get away from home. This is an interesting set here. This is a group of 1870s square nails from the Rock Creek Gold Rush. Gold Rush has really put BC on the map. After Fort Langley, the first town was New Westminster, and that was established by Queen Victoria to be the royal town on the mainland. And it still has the Royal Penitentiary as a result, and some antique stores. But I want to get back to these antique stores here, so let's go.